Okay, welcome to Positivity Bias. We're on chapter 12, and I think this is the core of a lot of positivity bias. This chapter is really the core of the whole thing. And it says think positive, right? And one of the challenges of this concept in our time is that there's been so much fake it till you make it, or think positive and it'll be, there's always these um I want to say quick fix philosophies of think positively, right? Um, and they have their merit, but this goes much deeper. This goes much, much deeper. And we're going to talk about the basics of it, but then we're going to go into a little bit more than what's actually in the book. We're going to dive into a little bit deeper the source of this concept to begin with. But let's start off with the first story. The first story here was when the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Lubavitch, is also referred to as the Tzemach Tzedek. There was a chassid who came to the Tzemach Tzedek to say that his son was very seriously ill. He traveled. He traveled quite a distance to come ask the Tzemach Tzedek for a bracha, for a blessing for his son. And when he finally got to the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe said 5 words: "Yitrach gut v'zayin gut." Think good and it'll be good, and sent him home. So that's a bracha. It's a blessing, right? But it's a blessing that you have to do. You have to tach good. You have to actually think positively. You have to think good, right? And so the chassid was putting his mind to it the whole travel home. He was putting his mind to the idea of thinking positively, because oftentimes when things go south, we tend to think the worst possible scenario. Um, and I know in emergency services, part of our training is to do that, is to think worst case scenario, and I'll back up from there. What do we do to mitigate that it doesn't get there, right? So it's part of our um,
mindset.
part of the mindset, but also as part of that situational analysis, right? It's part of how bad could this get, and how do we make sure it doesn't get there? So it's part of the analysis, and also the whole situation is how to make sure we can mitigate those, right? So by the time the chassid actually got home, his son was fine and out and playing. So clearly he was astounded, but we've seen situations like this time and time again where the positive thinking um, actualizes a reality. That's the bottom line, right? So when we ask the
Oh, I just
question,
bought one of the Powerball tickets. I'm going to think good.
I was talking about that earlier about a friend of mine that said buying a lottery ticket is tremendous entertainment. Best buck for your dollar is the fantasies that you can have are great entertainment. As long as you realize that you're buying the lottery ticket for the fantasy entertainment, then you're good. Then you're good, right? God will find a way. If you're meant to have it, God will find a way. And you don't need to buy a ticket. You can, but it's not necessary, right?
That's like the old joke where the guy is praying to God and he's saying, I pray, I'm religious, I observe, and you never help me. And he hears a voice from on high, you gotta buy a ticket.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So the reality is, yeah, I always think about that old song from Fiddler on the Roof from Tevye, right? It says, would it spoil some vast eternal plan if I was a wealthy man? Yeah, actually, yeah, it would.
It's the eternal plan.
I'm just saying it would. So this is part of the plan. And if the plan is that you actually have to play that role and win the lottery, then you will, you know. And it could be that a friend bought a ticket as your birthday present and handed it to you, and then you won, right? You don't have to buy the ticket. If that's what's going to be, it's going to be regardless of. But we do have to, we do have to make our own vessels. We have to be deserving of, right? And that's one of the questions that we want to talk about, the idea of deserving of, right? Because we have this mindset of, there is a place in Torah for reward and punishment. You do what you're supposed to be doing with the mitzvahs, you do get rewards. If you don't, there are consequences. So where do we come off with this idea of, even if I know I don't deserve, trach gut wird sein gut. If I think positively, it'll be good, right? So the Rebbe spoke about this in 1963 at an address on this concept of trach gut wird sein gut, right? And he said like this: when a person decides to place their trust in God, believing that their current crisis will be reserved favorably despite facing a bleak reality, they will, in effect, rise above their own nature, which in turn elicits reciprocally the suspension of the divine order, in which only the righteous are deserving of salvation. So, in other words, what we're saying here is that as a result of thinking positively, extraordinary things happen. So, I want to go back to the source of this idea, right? The source of this is discussed about, it's a book called Chavesh Levavis, Duties of the Heart. Chavesh Levavis was written by Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pakuda about 1100 years ago. He was one of the scholars of the men of the golden age of Spain. And this whole sefer, this whole book called Chavesh Levavis, Duties of the Heart, was in response to his thought of, we hear about all the responsibility of doing Torah and mitzvahs, but what about those mitzvahs that are responsibilities of the heart? To love God, to honor God, to fear God, to trust God. All of these, which are emotional duties of the heart, how do you command those and how do you fulfill them? And that's what his book, Chavis Levavis, is all about. And there's one chapter in there called Shahar B'tochen, the gate of trust. The gate of trust. And he goes, and in his sefer, he takes it a very logical path, right? The get rich quick scheme back then was alchemy. So if you had the tools and the chemistry to take any metal and turn it into gold, then you had all the wealth in the world you could want. So he takes that concept and he puts it juxtaposition to trust in God. So if you have the tools to make gold, you're always still going to be worried about your supply chain. And then you have that question of, do I make an advance and save it? Well, what if the king hears about it and knows I've got stores of gold? He's going to come and take it. And so he goes back and forth between all the things you could think about if you had that capacity to make gold and the worries you might have. And yet, when you talk about betachan, trust in God, you're not worried about the supply chain because God can figure that out. You're not worried about someone coming and stealing because you got plenty of trust for everybody, right? So he juxtapositioned this whole thing. But regarding our topic here, what he mentions there is that if I know me, and I know the stuff I still do wrong, and I know my daily failures, and I know that I'm not deserving of God's blessings for health or wealth or whatever I would want, right? So I know I'm not deserving of that. So by what audacity can I turn around and expect that God will still deliver it anyway? Good question, right? And that's the essence of what the Rebbe is saying here, is that if you have the betachan, the trust, that number one, God cares about you and he wants what's best for you, like any dad, right? And he wants to do the good things. He wants to bless you. And If you trust that he will, then that trust in and of itself is what creates the merit. Trusting that God will want to will do wants to and will do good to you in spite of everything, that trust in and of itself raises you up above the natural order that God can do so. Now, I think if we use the parent-child idea, we can all relate to this as either as a child or as a parent. The child, how many times do we come and say all kinds of wonderful, good things to try and butter up the parents in order to get what we want? And the mere faith that they love us and they want to do us good stuff and they're going to try and find a way to say yes, that in and of itself is the merit. And the reverse is true also. How many times as a parent, when someone came up and knew full well they didn't deserve it, but at the same time, yeah, I want to do that anyway, right? I can think of numerous times when kids misbehaved and did not deserve the day trip that we were about to do. But hell, I wanted them with us. So yes, you're coming. Because I love them so much. And yes, I know you caused trouble. You don't deserve to come, but I want you to come. So get in the car. We're going. But that's the kind of love that God has for us. And if we can lean into that and have the trust that God wants to deliver, then the fact that we trust, that's already a reason for him to deliver. It's having lifted ourselves above the natural order. That's what the Rebbe was talking about. We merit an extra measure of divine generosity, divine grace in that moment. So if you think about it, it's actually not easy to do. It's not easy to do. I had a poster in my room when I was in high school that said, "It's hard to remember you came to drain the swamp when you're up to your armpits in alligators."
Yeah. I've heard that a little bit differently, different part of the
Well,
analogy,
okay, but this is a public forum and we're going to be recording here. But the idea is that in stressful situations, it's hard to have that bitachon. It's hard to have that trust, right? Especially when you know you don't merit. So it's actually hard work to constantly be thinking, it's going to be all right, it's going to be fine, it's going to be great. It's actually going to work out marvelous. And that's Bob, you're on mute, Bob.
The parent-child example that you gave, I think, is perfectly apropos because as a child, you may be convinced that your parents love you and are only interested in your best interests, but you still don't like what they're doing for you. And you may say, and they may say to you, when you're older, you'll understand. Well, to the kid, that's forever. That getting older isn't what's important. It's now that's important. And
Yeah,
we're no
yeah.
different.
But think about it also this way, is that how many times does the kid get a smack and then go running right to the parent that smacked him for support?
Well, that's an example I'd rather you didn't use. That's a very complex. That's a Stockholm syndrome type.
Oh, no, no, that's absolute love. That's the love of a parent and child where the kid knows at the end of the day, the parent loves me and it's hard to accept the reprimand, but when you it's interesting psychologically, the kids that rebel against their parents are oftentimes it's not always a fast rule, but oftentimes the kids that rebel at home are the ones that have a strong relationship with parents, so they know they can rebel and still be safe. Kids that don't have that relationship are afraid to rebel because it may mean total rejection, and they don't have that much connection to start. So it's a very fascinating. Now there is a Stockholm thing. I got that one, yeah, but it's fascinating that the other dynamics that oftentimes can come into play. But in Shara B'Tochen, that's what he talks about, is the fact that if you're actively working to have a positive attitude, and you're actively working to trust that as bad as it looks now, God has my best interest in mind. And to have that trust and to activate it. The guy going home from the Rebbe to his son who was not well, that's all he thought about is tracht gut wird sein gut. Think good, it'll be good. Trust in God. God wants the best for me. He thought about that the whole way home and found out, yeah, well, it happened. But that's hard to do. It's hard to do when you're up to your armpits in alligators to trust that this is perfect. This situation is excellent, and the outcome is going to be phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. I remember a situation where I won't go into too many details, but a situation where at the last minute, where we couldn't host the party that was planned,
Because
we had less than 48 hours to come up with an alternative location to host the party at a time when it was going to be a Friday night party, and at a time when my wife was not able to walk. This was before the knee transplant, the knee replacements. She couldn't walk more than a half mile. So we literally had to be within a half a mile of the Airbnb that we were staying in to be able to host this party off base. And my response to the person who was most worried was, don't worry, we'll look into it. I'm sure God has a much better plan in mind than we thought, and it's going to be fantastic. And the airman said, okay, let it go. And my wife and I started looking at options to see what we could do and what would be an option. And the end result was beyond anything we would have even have tried to figure out to begin with. We ended up in a place that had a dining room and living room with a side room with a kitchen, and they were barely going to even charge us. They felt it was a tremendous honor to be able to host, and literally gave us a place, and it was a quarter of a mile from the house. So, boo,
Well
but
done.
that's one of those things, is that if you practice this stuff, it blows your mind when it actually works, because it's that powerful, it's that crazy. But it is an effort. It is an effort, a conscientious effort to completely trust in God, that it's going to be really great, and the merit of that trust is what creates the blessing. So it's a fascinating piece. There was a story here that shares about in 1957. This was, again, 57 was a while ago. We didn't have the communication stuff that we have nowadays, right? There was a young man that received a letter from home saying that his father had suffered a heart attack and was in critical condition. And so this one, the phone calls were very expensive, and the best way to do this was, and it was kind of rare. So this young man wrote a note to the Rebbe explaining the situation and ending with the words, "I don't even know what to think at this point," because he's so far away, and what is he going to do, right? He's in New York, and his parents are in Israel. He got this letter from home. He wrote to the Rebbe like, "I don't even know what to think because it's so far away, and what's going to be," right? And the Rebbe responded very, very shortly. The Rebbe responded with a quick sentence that said, shocking. In other words, the idea that you don't know what to think, shocking, because the instructions of our sages in such a situation is very well known. Tracht gut, wird sein gut. Await good news. And when the kid was able to actually reach his mother by phone, which was very expensive back then, when he did reach, he asked how is his father? And she said, he's out of danger. When did that happen? Thursday night. What was the timing of when he went into the Rebbe and got the bracha, where the Rebbe told him, Trach gut wird sein gut? It's Thursday night. The power of positive thinking, right? Now, here's the other piece of this again, going a little bit deeper. Why does this work? Why is it that thinking positive things can manifest a positive outcome? How does that work, right? We really shouldn't be so surprised. We really shouldn't be surprised. Because if we look back at the concept of creation, the Jewish concept of creation, right? The Torah teaches us that God thought about creating a world. He spoke and it came into being. Thought, speech, action. This is not rocket science. It may be quantum physics, though. I don't know. But the idea is that when we think good things and we speak out those good things, they can manifest. And that's how the world actually has always worked since the beginning of creation. So we really shouldn't be so surprised that if we think good and talk positively, that will be the results, because that's the process of creation to begin with. But still, we seem to be surprised. Maybe it's because it works for us. That's the unique part, right? And I think the other part about this concept, hey, Fred, the other part that's good about interesting about this concept, right, is what are the limiting factors? Our thoughts. That's it. The limiting factors are our thoughts. My mind goes all over the place, right? So how many of you remember the Green Lantern?
I think I do.
What was the superpower of the Green Lantern? If you can think it, it creates. You got to imagine. If you can imagine it, it creates, and that was his superpower. So,
and if you recall, the Green Lantern was not supposed to be a factual story. It was supposed to be fiction.
Yes, and it was supposed to be a comic, which was funny. But at the same time, the limitations are oftentimes self-created. If we sat down and started collecting all the times in our history, and each of us has got more than most of us have got half a century behind us. And if we think back, how many times did the impossible actually happen? Like, no way it would ever work out, and oh my God, it did, right? If we would collect those things, it's astounding how often stuff like that can happen. Having worked in the medical field, and Selena, you can probably share a story here. So you're up next. So that's your forewarning, right? How many times has medical science come up with something, nothing short of miraculous, blow your mind kind of stuff. We had a retired Air Force colonel, doctor, who was in charge of the Air Force airvacs to Germany. And he shared with us a presentation he made to the Joint Chief of Staffs in honor of D-Day, the anniversary of D-Day. And his presentation was, here is where military medical was on D-Day, and here's where we are now. I mean, this presentation was like 5 years ago, 10 or so, but on D-Day, you had whole blood. You didn't have plasma or anything else. You had whole blood, and even the whole blood was in glass jars. So there's no way it's going into a combat scene.
Mhm.
And if you were going to do a transfusion, it was literally person to person. And we weren't checking blood types because we didn't know about that yet. And here we are now, where the blood is separated into parts, and you're going to get what you need, whether it's the plasma or the red blood cells or the white whatever it is you're going to need, you're going to get that, and you're going to get it in a bag on scene. Come on, that's got to blow your mind, right? When I think of LASIK surgery nowadays, Selena, give me an example of something that blew your mind in the medical field in your experience.
Um, Surgery. Years ago, they were just doing mastectomies, and now that's a lower percentage because they have so many other procedures that they can do to save that part of the body. And well, I guess the robotics, that blows my mind. How they can do all the surgeries, the TAVRs for um, the procedures on the heart, where they don't have to do where if they had to open they do the break the sternum and all of that complexity, which they don't have to do anymore. They can go in through another method. So I think
So,
that that's amazing.
and my example is having had two heart stents put in. Each one was through the wrist, and both actually a year, 2 years apart, 3 years, 3 years apart, but through the same spot.
Mhm.
And they did the whole thing, right? Just going through there, right? It's phenomenal. So,
Yeah, recovery is much quicker. You don't have to be
oh
in the hospital as long. Um, they used to do catheterizations through the groin, and now it's the
yeah,
same thing. They go through the forearm, and you can go home the same day without bags, with
yeah,
the weight bags.
amazing, amazing stuff, right?
Mhm.
So medical science is just one example of the speed of which things change, right? So,
David, what was the first kind of a radio that you had?
transistor.
Don't you? You're too young to remember making a crystal set.
No, no, I never did that. Never made a crystal set.
Jeff, do you remember? Are you old enough for that?
Crystal set. I remember doing that as a project.
That was in my lifetime.
I
Yeah.
wasn't born yet.
Oh, well, we did a touring about radios, actually.
I remember
That's
going
like
into
TV without the picture.
yeah. I remember the pharmacies had test units,
Yes, yes. I worked at a pharmacy with the big test unit for all the tubes because a lot of
all the
people
tubes,
had
yeah.
radio
Yeah,
tubes. That was in the
exactly.
70s.
So when you talk about the project, the progress, I mean, look at what we're using right now.
Yeah. Right.
We take this for granted.
So, with that in mind, who's to say that whatever bracha we're looking for is impossible? We should know better. Our generation, more than any generation in history, should know this. because what was impossible when we were kids, like going to the moon, that's old hat already. It was, you remember the book 1984? A futuristic book. So
Earth to
we
moon,
more we
all
more
the
than any
science fiction, all the science fiction uh, of those days was just that. It was science fiction.
Mhm.
And but it always on the premise, if you could think it, you could do it.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Which is why we started off with flip phones because Star Trek had already done it, so we had to design it to look like what Star Trek had. And then we have the Apple Watches that Dick Tracy used to use, right?
And look at the Jetsons, the cartoon, the Jetsons. Now they have flying cars that are in experimental stage.
Exactly.
And we microwave our food. So, so for us to believe the impossible could happen tomorrow, that shouldn't be a stretch. That shouldn't be a stretch because we've seen this happen again and again and again in our own lifetime. Amazing, impossible stuff that now we just take for granted.
The impossible isn't always good, though.
Granted, I mentioned microwave. I didn't say it was healthy.
Well, the microwave is now a weapon that the Russians are using.
Oh,
I'm sure
And
we do too.
at the same time, the internet that we're using for this call was a military creation.
Most things were.
Yes, because they're the ones who'll spend the money,
mhm.
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So it shouldn't surprise us that we can think about positive things and they literally around the corner, and we shouldn't be surprised when it pops up overnight because somebody's been working on it for years in their garage. And when it happens overnight, no, it's not overnight. It took 15, 20 years of work on the side and it came to light overnight, right? So cures, formalities, uh, miraculous things, all of these things, they should not be so hard to imagine. Tracht gut wird sein gut is a matter of, are we willing to put in effort, the effort to think positively and believe good outcomes are literally around the corner, and we're going to be so excited when it happens because we were waiting for it, we were expecting it. And
Okay.
Hasidus, Kabbalah goes back and says that again, this is the process of creation. Think, speak, create. It happens. So it comes back to feeling an empowerment to focus on the positive things and manifest them. And it's not hocus pocus voodoo or some, you know, crazy contraption. It's real, and we can do it, but it's hard work, and the merit of the hard work is the actualization of it. So, wrapping up the class, what do you walk away with? What can you do with this information?
If you
What can
dream it,
one,
if you
I'm,
dream it, you can do it.
Dream it, you can do it.
what can one do with it, or what can a particular individual do with it?
Yes, exactly.
One can use it for positive,
Yes.
but that's a lot easier said than done.
And that's why we merit the actualization of it, is because it's not as if we do nothing but pray for a good outcome. no, praying for a good outcome is a good thing, but trusting is the hard work.
Mhm.
Oh, you're saying you have to have batachen?
To have bitachon, to actually trust, that is the hard work.
Yeah, that's kind of an impossible thing, I think.
Well, we just spent a half hour talking about how it is possible.
Well, yeah, I guess God just I don't have any Mount Sinai moments in my life, you know. I told you this. And nobody ever comes back from death and reports back. We need to set out spies like Moses did. Well, actually they didn't come back with good reports either.
Right, exactly, exactly. They didn't track good, and look what happened, right? But
Yeah.
Jeff, think back. Got to be at least one example. I know it's there. There's got to be at least one example where you expected positive and it actually happened. And you didn't expect positive because it was to be expected, but
Right
rather
now, it doesn't come to the top of my head, but about 3 o'clock in the morning when it pops, then I'll give you a holler.
you got it.